Welcome to All-Time Epic Stories. Today, we present, Unearthing the Lost Epic, the real story behind King Arthur's sword. Deep beneath the green hills of Britain lies a mystery that has captivated humanity for over 1500 years. Not just a tale of kings and kingdoms, but a question that bridges myth and reality: did Excalibur truly exist? The legend speaks of a blade drawn from stone, a sword gifted by mystical waters, a weapon that chose its bearer. But behind every legend lies a kernel of truth, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to dig deeper. Our journey begins not in Camelot's imagined halls, but in the workshops of ancient metallurgists, where the art of sword-making was as much alchemy as it was craft, and where blades were indeed born from stone. In the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Roman Empire crumbled and Britain descended into what history would call the Dark Ages, the knowledge of superior metalworking became more precious than gold itself. The Celts and later the Romano British peoples understood something profound: a sword was never merely a weapon. It was a symbol of power, a repository of prestige, and in skilled hands, the difference between survival and extinction. Archaeological excavations across Britain have unearthed hundreds of ceremonial swords, many deliberately broken or bent, deposited in rivers, lakes, and bogs as offerings to gods whose names we've long forgotten. These ritual deposits tell us something crucial: swords and water were intimately connected in the ancient British psyche. The Lady of the Lake may have been born from this very real tradition. But what of the sword in the stone? This image seems pure fantasy, until we understand the medieval term for an anvil, and the literal process by which iron becomes steel. Iron ore is, quite literally, pulled from stone. The smelting process involves heating iron-bearing rock until the metal separates and can be extracted, a transformation that would have seemed magical to those who didn't understand the chemistry involved. In Dark Age Britain, the master smiths who could perform this transformation were treated with reverence bordering on fear. They were keepers of secret knowledge, wielders of earth and fire. The Romano British and early medieval periods saw the development of pattern-welded blades, swords created by forging together multiple strips of iron and steel, creating weapons of superior strength and flexibility. These pattern-welded swords required hundreds of hours of labor, folding the metal dozens of times, each iteration removing impurities and creating a blade that could flex without breaking, cut without dulling. The patterns created in these blades were not merely decorative. They were proof of quality, a visible signature of the smith's skill, and they gave each sword a unique, almost living appearance. Such a weapon would indeed have seemed magical to contemporaries. A sword that could cut through lesser blades, that bore mysterious patterns like rippling water or flowing serpents, would naturally attract legends. Now we must turn to the historical figure who may have inspired Arthur. In the chaos following Rome's withdrawal from Britain, war leaders emerged to fight against Saxon invasions from the continent. Welsh and Breton sources from the 9th and 10th centuries mention a warrior called Arthur, though details vary wildly. What remains consistent is his association with a remarkable sword and 12 victorious battles. The earliest mention of Arthur's sword comes from the Welsh tale Caledfwlch and Olwen, written around 1100 but preserving much older oral traditions. Here the sword is named Caledfwlch, meaning hard cleft or hard lightning. This name evolved through Norman French into Excalibur, but its original Welsh form tells us something important: the sword was associated with striking power and the ability to cleave through obstacles. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in 1136, gave us the Latin name Caliburnus and placed the sword's origin in Avalon, the mythical isle. But Geoffrey was a creative chronicler, blending history with invention. The sword in stone motif appears later, added by French poet Robert de Boron around 1200. He may have been inspired by the Italian legend of Saint Galgano, who thrust his sword into rock as a renunciation of violence. The real sword of San Galgano still exists near Siena, Italy, its blade extending into solid rock. Scientific analysis has confirmed it dates to the 12th century, proof that such a feat was physically possible. Could a sword be thrust into stone without breaking? Modern metallurgical testing shows that high-quality medieval swords, if driven with sufficient force into soft limestone or sandstone, could indeed penetrate and hold. But we must return to Britain and the deeper archaeological record. In 2017, a remarkable discovery was made in the River Witham, where a Bronze Age sword was found still embedded in its wooden hilt after 3,000 years. This and similar finds demonstrate the exceptional preservation possible in Britain's waterways, and remind us that countless weapons remain undiscovered, waiting in dark water and deep mud. The tradition of depositing valuable weapons in water spans thousands of years in Britain, from the Bronze Age through the medieval period. This wasn't random disposal but deliberate ritual. These offerings were made at liminal spaces, boundaries between land and water, earth and sky, the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Lakes, springs, and rivers were considered gateways to the otherworld. The Lady of the Lake makes perfect sense in this context. She's not merely a fantasy figure but a memory of ancient priestesses who presided over sacred waters and the rituals performed there. In 2001, a stunning discovery was made at Sutton Hoo, the famous Anglo-Saxon burial site. Among the treasures was a sword with a gold and garnet pommel, the finest weapon yet found from the period. This weapon demonstrated that Dark Age Britain was capable of producing swords of astounding quality, works of art that were also supremely functional tools of war. These were weapons worthy of legend. But the most intriguing evidence comes from linguistic analysis. The name Excalibur, scholars now believe, may derive from the Latin calibs, meaning steel, specifically the high-quality steel from Chalybes in Asia Minor. Calibian steel was renowned throughout the ancient world for its superior quality. If Arthur's sword was made from imported steel or by techniques learned from Eastern smiths, it would indeed have been exceptional. Trade routes connected Britain to the far corners of the known world. Roman infrastructure may have collapsed, but merchant vessels still crossed seas, carrying not just goods but knowledge and technique. In 2019, archaeologists working at Tintagel, the legendary birthplace of Arthur, uncovered evidence of Mediterranean trade in the 5th and 6th centuries, exactly Arthur's supposed era. The site was far from isolated. Among the finds were fragments of high-quality glass and pottery from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, proof that whoever controlled Tintagel had access to luxury goods and likely military equipment from distant lands. Now we must address the metallurgy itself. What made a sword superior in this era? The answer lies in carbon content, forging technique, and the mysterious process of quenching. Iron alone is relatively soft. But iron combined with carbon becomes steel, and the percentage of carbon determines whether the blade will be flexible or brittle, tough or fragile. Ancient smiths didn't understand chemistry, but through generations of trial and error, they learned to control carbon content by adjusting furnace temperature, fuel type, and forging time. The quenching process was surrounded by ritual and secrecy. Swords might be quenched in water taken from sacred springs, or even in blood or urine, each smith swearing by their particular method. Modern analysis shows some of these superstitious practices actually worked. Organic compounds in blood or urine, or minerals in spring water, could alter the surface properties of the steel in beneficial ways. The pattern welding we mentioned earlier reached its zenith in Migration period and early medieval Europe. The technique created blades with distinctive wavy or serpentine patterns, earning names like wirm fa, serpent marked. Creating such a blade required folding the steel up to 20 times, creating thousands of layers. Each fold removed impurities and distributed carbon evenly, resulting in a blade that was both hard and flexible. But there was an even more advanced technique, making composite blades with a hard steel edge welded to a tough iron core. This gave the best of both properties, a blade that could hold a razor edge but wouldn't shatter on impact. The Japanese katana, famous for its cutting ability, uses exactly this technique. But recent analysis shows that some Dark Age European swords employed the same principle, centuries earlier than previously thought. In 2012, a remarkable sword was discovered during dredging operations in the River Witham. Dating to around 1000 CE, it showed evidence of complex pattern welding and selective hardening of the edge. Metallurgical analysis revealed something extraordinary. The smith had somehow achieved a carbon gradient, with the edge containing higher carbon content than the spine, exactly what modern bladesmiths strive for. This level of sophistication suggests that the finest Dark Age smiths understood their craft at an almost intuitive level, achieving through experience what we now accomplish through precise temperature control and chemical analysis. Such weapons would have been incredibly valuable, worth a fortune in livestock, land, or gold. A truly superior sword might represent a year's production from an entire estate. These blades were named, given identities and histories. They were inherited, presented as gifts between rulers, and yes, sometimes deposited in water as offerings too valuable for any mortal to wield. The sagas and epics of Northern Europe are filled with named swords, Gram, Turfing, Durendal, each with its own story. Excalibur fits perfectly into this tradition of weapons as legendary entities. But let's examine specific archaeological finds that might connect to Arthur. In 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have discovered Arthur's tomb and, some accounts suggest, a great sword. Modern historians generally consider this a pious fraud, designed to attract pilgrims and revenue to the abbey. But the claim reveals how powerful the Arthur legend had become by the 12th century. Yet archaeology has vindicated some supposedly mythical locations. Tintagel, Cadbury Castle, and other Arthurian sites have yielded evidence of sophisticated occupation during the right time period. At Cadbury Castle in Somerset, excavations in the 1960s uncovered a massive fortified settlement from the late 5th and early 6th centuries, exactly when Arthur supposedly lived. The site showed evidence of contact with the Mediterranean world, sophisticated metalworking, and the capacity to support a war band of several hundred warriors. This was no petty chieftain's refuge. Could the ruler of such a fortress have possessed a remarkable sword, perhaps acquired through Mediterranean trade or crafted by a master smith in his service? The evidence suggests this is entirely possible. Now we must consider the symbolic importance of swords in Dark Age leadership. Archaeological evidence shows that high-status burials almost always included weapons, particularly swords. But the truly interesting pattern is this: the finest swords were often ritually killed, bent or broken before burial, or deposited in water. The weapon died with its owner or was returned to the gods. This might explain why we haven't found Excalibur. If Arthur existed and possessed a legendary sword, tradition would have demanded it be given to water or earth, not preserved in a treasury. The romantic image of the sword being cast into the lake, received by a mysterious hand, might preserve the memory of this actual practice, transformed by centuries of retelling into magical narrative. In 2015, a remarkable experiment was conducted. Master bladesmiths attempted to recreate a pattern-welded sword using only tools and techniques available in the 6th century. The process took over 6 months of intermittent work, required 3 skilled smiths working in rotation, and consumed vast quantities of charcoal. The result was a blade that exceeded all expectations. Testing showed the recreated blade could cut through rolled straw mats, pig carcasses, and even inferior quality swords without damage to the edge. It was indeed a superior weapon by any standard. The distinctive pattern along the blade caught light and seemed to shimmer and flow. In firelight or sunlight, such a weapon would appear almost alive, the metal seeming to move like water or flame. This visual quality would have added to the sword's legendary status. Witnesses seeing such a blade for the first time would struggle to explain what they were seeing, resorting to descriptions of magic and enchantment. Inscriptions on some surviving swords add another dimension. Several pattern-welded blades bear runic inscriptions with the smith's name or magical formulas meant to enhance the weapon's power. One 9th-century sword found in the Rhine bears the inscription Ulfbert, a smith's name that appears on dozens of high-quality blades across Europe, suggesting a workshop or brand of immense prestige. Analysis of Ulfbert swords revealed they were made from crucible steel, a technique thought to have been lost in Europe at that time. Someone had access to extraordinary metallurgical knowledge. If such sophisticated metallurgy existed in the 9th century, it's entirely plausible that similar knowledge existed in the 6th century but was lost during the intervening chaos and cultural disruption. The collapse of Roman Britain was catastrophic. Urban centers were abandoned, literacy declined precipitously, and technical knowledge that depended on specialized training and resources simply disappeared. A master smith in this environment would have been invaluable, worth protecting and supporting. His knowledge might represent the difference between victory and defeat in the endless small wars of the period. This brings us to another aspect of the legend, the sword's supposed magical properties. Excalibur was said to make its bearer invincible, to blind enemies, and to mark its wielder as the rightful king. Strip away the supernatural language and we're left with something recognizable: psychological warfare. A warrior known to possess a superior weapon would have a significant advantage before fighting even began. If Arthur existed and possessed a blade significantly better than those of his opponents, his victories would have seemed to prove the weapon's power, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of invincibility. The sword's scabbard, according to later legend, was even more valuable than the blade itself, preventing wounds and stopping bleeding. This might preserve memory of advanced medical knowledge. Or it might refer to the practical reality that keeping a blade properly sheathed and oiled prevented rust and maintained the edge, making the scabbard indeed crucial to the weapon's effectiveness. Let's now consider the cultural context. In Celtic tradition, objects could possess their own spirit or personality. A warrior's weapons were extensions of himself, partners rather than mere tools. This worldview explains why swords were named, why they were inherited with ceremony, and why destroying or surrendering them was considered a profound act with spiritual significance. When Christianity overlaid these older beliefs, the sword took on new symbolism. It became a cross-shaped emblem of righteous authority, divine favor, and the fight against paganism. The Arthurian legends we know were shaped by medieval Christian authors who reinterpreted earlier Celtic and Romano British stories through their own theological and political lens. But archaeological evidence suggests the historical Arthur, if he existed, would have been a Romano British Christian fighting to preserve what remained of Roman civilization against pagan Saxon invaders. In this context, a superior sword would have been more than a weapon. It would have been a symbol of continuity with Roman military might, a technological advantage representing civilized order against barbarism. The poem Y Gododdin, dated to around 600 CE, just after Arthur's supposed lifetime, mentions warriors being measured against Arthur's standard. He was already legendary within living memory. This rapid legendary status suggests Arthur, or whoever inspired the legend, must have been truly exceptional. Ordinary war leaders didn't become legendary benchmarks within a generation. Now let's examine physical evidence from Arthur's supposed era. The Staffordshire Hoard, discovered in 2009, contained over 3,500 pieces of gold and silver metalwork from the 7th century. Among the treasures were dozens of sword pommels and hilt plates of exquisite workmanship, proving that Dark Age Britain possessed extraordinary metalworking skills and access to precious materials. These weren't ceremonial pieces but fittings from actual war swords, showing that the finest warriors combined lethal functionality with stunning artistry in their weapons. If such wealth and skill existed in the 7th century, it certainly existed in the 6th. The Arthurian period was not a backward age but one of sophisticated, if localized, civilization. Recent isotope analysis of metals from this period shows that trade networks extended from Ireland to the Black Sea. Britain was connected to a vast web of exchange in materials and ideas. An ambitious war leader with resources and connections could have commissioned or acquired a blade made from the finest materials, crafted using the best techniques available anywhere in the known world. Such a weapon would have been unique in Britain, unmatched by local products. In combat, it would have performed noticeably better, cutting through shields and armor that stopped lesser blades. Word would have spread with each battle. The sword that never dulled, that cut through everything, wielded by a leader who never lost. Reality would feed legend, and legend would feed morale and reputation. When that leader fell, tradition would have demanded the weapon be removed from circulation. It couldn't be inherited or captured. It had to go to the gods, returned to the waters from which its metal had symbolically come. This might explain a curious detail in the legend, why Bedivere hesitates to throw Excalibur into the lake. The sword represented enormous material value. Destroying it was economically absurd. But symbolic and religious necessity overrode practical concerns. The sword had to be sacrificed, even if it meant the loss of a military advantage and incredible wealth. This is precisely what archaeological evidence shows actually happened. Modern technology has allowed researchers to map lake and river beds across Britain using sonar and magnetometry. Hundreds of locations show metallic anomalies that might be ancient weapon deposits. Many of these sites are precisely where legend places significant events in Arthur's story. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps the legends preserve accurate geographical memory across 15 centuries. Excalibur itself has never been found, and likely never will be. But dozens of comparable swords have emerged from Britain's waters, each one a potential window into the reality behind the legend. Each discovery refines our understanding. Modern metallurgy can now tell us where ore was mined, what techniques were used, even individual smiths' distinctive working styles preserved in the metal structure. What emerges is a picture of Dark Age Britain far more sophisticated than the name suggests. This was a world of skilled artisans, international trade, and yes, occasionally, weapons of extraordinary quality. Could Arthur have existed? Could he have possessed a legendary sword? The evidence says yes to both. The real question is not whether such things were possible, but which of many possible realities gave birth to the legend we inherited. The truth about Excalibur lies not in finding one specific sword, but in understanding that the legend preserves genuine memories of material culture, ritual practice, and perhaps, one exceptional weapon wielded by one exceptional man. We know swords were drawn from stone, through the smelting process. We know superior blades existed, made by techniques we're still rediscovering. We know weapons were deposited in lakes as sacred offerings. We know war leaders of the period had access to international trade goods and employed skilled craftsmen. We know the Celtic and Romano British peoples viewed exceptional weapons as having spiritual significance. Every element of the Excalibur legend has roots in documented reality. The myth didn't emerge from nothing but from lived experience, transformed by time and retelling into something simultaneously more and less than truth. Modern experimental archaeology has shown that recreating such weapons is possible using period techniques. Master smiths today can forge blades that match or exceed the performance of ancient examples. But these modern smiths have advantages their ancient counterparts lacked: metallurgical science, consistent materials, and freedom from warfare and scarcity. What the ancients achieved is in some ways more impressive. The legendary qualities attributed to Excalibur, unbreakable, ever sharp, gleaming like fire, are not supernatural but the natural effects of a supremely well-made pattern-welded steel blade. Such a weapon would have seemed miraculous to contemporaries who had never seen its equal. To them, the difference between a good sword and a great one was the difference between human and divine craft. The archaeological record will continue to reveal new treasures. Britain's waterways, construction sites, and fields still conceal countless artifacts. Perhaps one day, we'll find a sword that could be Excalibur itself. Or perhaps we already have. Dozens of pattern-welded swords from the right period sit in museum collections, their full stories unknown. Any one of them might have been legendary in its own time. The power of the Excalibur legend lies not in one specific artifact but in what it represents: the human drive to create excellence, to imbue objects with meaning, and to remember greatness across centuries. Every culture has its legendary weapons. From the Japanese kusanagi to the Norse gram, from Roland's Durendal to Charlemagne's Joyeuse. These stories speak to universal human experiences and values. But Excalibur holds unique power in the Western imagination. It represents not just military might but rightful authority, not just destruction but justice, not just possession but worthiness. The question of who could draw the sword from the stone was really a question of legitimacy: who has the right to lead? This remains relevant today, making Arthur's story perpetually contemporary. The archaeological and historical evidence shows that the legend could be true in its essentials. Not in supernatural details, but in the existence of an exceptional leader with an exceptional weapon. That weapon might still exist somewhere, buried in mud, locked in museum storage, or dissolved entirely by rust and time. Or perhaps its true legacy is not the object but the idea. Recent advances in materials science have even allowed researchers to recreate the exact metallurgical composition of pattern-welded swords, understanding finally what made them superior. The smiths who forged these blades were scientists in their way, conducting experiments across generations, preserving successful techniques as closely guarded secrets, advancing their art incrementally. When Roman Britain collapsed, much of this knowledge vanished. The Arthurian period might represent a last flowering of Roman metallurgical expertise before it was lost for centuries. This makes Arthur's sword even more poignant. It might have been one of the last examples of a dying art, literally irreplaceable, its loss representing not just one weapon but an entire tradition. The medieval Romance writers who gave us the full Arthurian legend were not historians, but they were preserving genuine cultural memory, encoded in symbol and story rather than date and detail. Modern archaeology has learned to read these stories as evidence. Where legend says Arthur fought, we dig and find fortifications from the right period. Where legend says swords lie, we search waters and find them. The relationship between myth and history is not opposition but dialogue. Each informs the other. Together, they bring us closer to a complex truth than either could alone. So what can we conclude about Excalibur? That it represents real practices of sword smithing, real traditions of sacred deposition, and possibly one real weapon owned by one real warrior prince. That warrior might not have been named Arthur, or his story might have merged with those of other war leaders. But someone, somewhere in Dark Age Britain, possessed a blade worthy of legend. The sword's physical location remains unknown, and likely always will. But its cultural location is clear, at the heart of British identity, symbol of a time when the impossible seemed achievable. Every generation reimagines Arthur and his sword for its own purposes. Medieval Christians made him a defender of faith. Victorian Romantics made him a chivalric ideal. We make him what we need him to be. But beneath these reinterpretations lies something constant, the historical probability of a real leader, a real sword, and a real moment when Britain's fate hung in balance. The archaeology tells us this leader would have been Romano British, Christian, fighting against pagan Germanic invaders. He would have seen himself as preserving civilization against barbarism. His sword would have been pattern-welded steel, possibly with steel from as far away as India or China, ornamented with gold and garnets, worth a fortune, and capable of performance that seemed supernatural. When he died, that sword would have been given to water, returned to the sacred depths, ensuring no unworthy hand would wield it. This was not waste but profound respect for the weapon and what it represented. Somewhere in Britain, probably in a lake or river bed long since buried by centuries of sediment, that sword still exists. Corroded, perhaps, but chemically stable, waiting for the moment of rediscovery. Whether we ever find it or not, the search itself is valuable. Every sword discovered adds to our understanding. Every analysis reveals new techniques. Every find rewrites some small part of history. The story of Excalibur, then, is really the story of humanity's relationship with technology, power, and memory. It's about how we make meaning from metal, and how stories preserve truths that pure facts cannot. It reminds us that the people of the so-called Dark Ages were not primitive or superstitious, but sophisticated craftspeople and strategic thinkers, working with the materials and knowledge available to them. Their legends were not idle fantasy but encoded knowledge, how to identify good steel, where sacred places were located, which leaders were worth following. Stories were databases before writing was common. In this light, the legend of Excalibur becomes a sophisticated mnemonic, preserving multiple layers of information about metallurgy, ritual, geography, and history in a form that could survive across non-literate generations. Modern scholars increasingly recognize that oral traditions can preserve accurate information across surprising lengths of time, especially when that information is culturally important and repeatedly reinforced. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been shown to preserve accurate accounts of geological events from over 7,000 years ago. European oral traditions might be capable of similar longevity. If this is true, then the core of the Arthur legend, a war leader with a remarkable sword fighting in the late 5th or early 6th century, might be historical memory rather than medieval invention. The archaeological evidence certainly supports this possibility. Everything the legend claims about the sword is plausible given what we know about Dark Age metallurgy and ritual practice. As technology advances, we can examine ancient weapons in ever greater detail. Techniques like neutron imaging and isotope analysis reveal information impossible to access even a decade ago. Each new discovery prompts us to revisit old ones with fresh eyes. Swords catalogued a century ago are now being reanalyzed, and many are revealing unexpected sophistication. The search for Excalibur, then, is not a quest for one specific object but an ongoing investigation into human ingenuity, cultural memory, and the complex relationship between history and legend. It teaches us humility about our assumptions. The past was neither as primitive as we once thought nor as magical as the legends claim. The truth lies in a middle ground of impressive human achievement. It also teaches us the power of stories. The legend of Excalibur has inspired countless people across 15 centuries, motivating quests for justice, excellence, and worthy leadership. Whether or not we ever hold the original Excalibur, we possess something perhaps more valuable, the idea it represents. That excellence is worth pursuing, that justice matters, that leadership must be earned. These are the real treasures unearthed by our investigation, not one specific sword, but the understanding that our ancestors were clever, that legends preserve truth, and that the past speaks if we learn to listen. The story of King Arthur's sword is ultimately a story about us, what we value, what we remember, and how we connect present to past through objects and stories that transcend their material existence. And so the quest continues. In museums and universities, in lakes and rivers, in archives and laboratories, researchers continue the search for Arthur and his sword, knowing that every discovery brings us closer to a truth more fascinating than any simple answer could be. The legend of Excalibur endures not because it's purely true or purely false, but because it captures something essential about human aspiration, the desire to create excellence, to wield power justly, and to be remembered for deeds worthy of legend. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, archaeology, and legend. If you found this investigation fascinating, please like, subscribe, and share. The quest for truth about our past continues, and your support helps us unearth more lost epics from history.